The British Empire was a colossal entity that stretched across every continent. At its zenith, it governed nearly a quarter of the world's landmass. It was famously said that the sun never set upon its territories. It was an empire built on the waves, sustained by commerce, and expanded through relentless conquest. The British Empire reshaped the world map, creating new countries and redrawing ancient boundaries. Its influence left an indelible mark on cultures, languages, and economies that persists to this day. It was an era of profound transformation, one that laid the foundations for the modern world. The empire was a living, breathing machine that never rested. Yet deep shadows were cast, hiding stories of resistance, exploitation, and the immense human cost. How did a small, rain-swept island nation construct the largest empire in history? The answer lies in ambition, opportunity, and brute force. In the late 15th century, England watched as Spain and Portugal amassed fortunes. Under Queen Elizabeth, England found itself in a struggle with Spain. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was a profound boost for the English nation. It announced England's arrival as a sea power. The path was now clear for English ships to venture out and carve out their own domains. At the same time, the first colonies were being planted in North America. Thus, the seeds of the British Empire were sown. From these beginnings, a global superpower would emerge. For generations, the story of the British Empire was often told as a grand and heroic epic. It was a narrative of brave explorers, brilliant administrators, and dedicated missionaries who brought civilization, commerce, and Christianity to the supposedly dark corners of the world. This official version, celebrated in school books, monuments, and public memory, painted a picture of a benevolent and progressive force. It spoke of building railways, establishing the rule of law, and abolishing supposedly barbaric practices in the lands it controlled. It was a story of glory, of progress, and of a great nation fulfilling its destiny to lead humanity toward a brighter future. This was the empire as it wanted to be remembered. However, behind this polished facade of glory lies a much more complex and often much darker, untold story. This is the story of conquest, not invitation, of exploitation, not partnership. It is a history written not just by the victors in their stately homes, but also in the blood and tears of the vanquished. This untold story speaks of the brutal realities of imperial expansion, the violent subjugation of indigenous peoples, the systematic looting of entire economies for the benefit of the metropole, and the imposition of foreign rule upon millions who never asked for it. It is a story that forces us to look beyond the triumphs and confront the devastating human cost of empire. This narrative delves into the experiences of the colonized, the people whose lives were irrevocably altered by the arrival of British ships on their shores. It is the story of the Indian weaver, whose livelihood was destroyed by cheap textiles from Manchester, the African farmer forced off their land to make way for cash crop plantations, and the indigenous Australian whose culture was systematically dismantled. It is a story of rebellion and resistance, of countless men and women who fought back against overwhelming odds to defend their freedom, their land, and their way of life. Their voices, for so long silenced or ignored, are essential to understanding the true nature of the imperial project. This essay seeks to tell that untold story. It aims to move beyond the simple binaries of good versus evil, and explore the messy, contradictory, and often brutal reality of how a small island nation came to dominate the world. We will investigate not only how the empire was built, but also why it ultimately crumbled. It is a journey that will take us from the boardrooms of the East India Company to the battlefields of Africa, from the slave plantations of the Caribbean to the heart of the independence movements that would eventually bring the entire edifice crashing down. This is the story behind the monuments, the truth behind the myths. The history of the British Empire is a legacy of both pride and pain. The empire built vast infrastructure projects, but this progress is scarred by profound pain. Britain played a horrific role in the transatlantic slave trade. Colonial policies exacerbated famines, leading to millions of deaths. This complicated inheritance continues to fuel debate. The legacy is visible everywhere. The story of the British Empire continues to shape our present and influence our future. It is a story of towering ambition and devastating consequences. The British Empire's story begins with England feeling left behind. Spain and Portugal charted new worlds, guided by the Treaty of Tordesillas. Their ships returned with gold and spices, marking the age of discovery. England, a forgotten island, watched from the sidelines. Seeing the riches extracted from the New World, English merchants and sailors grew restless. They honed their skills and built larger ships. The psychological barrier to expansion was formidable, with Spain guarding its colonies jealously. This danger forged a defiant English identity defined by Protestant faith and maritime prowess. England's entry into the imperial race would be one of confrontation. When Queen Elizabeth I ascended to the throne in 1558, she inherited a nation that was diplomatically isolated, financially strained, and militarily outmatched by Spain. Unable to challenge the Spanish Empire directly, Elizabeth embraced a more pragmatic strategy. She unofficially sanctioned a generation of privateers. These men were, for all intents and purposes, state-sponsored pirates. Figures like John Hawkins and most famously Sir Francis Drake were given license to raid Spanish colonies and plunder their treasure fleets. They were the tip of England's spear, a deniable asset that could weaken a rival, enrich the crown, and build invaluable maritime experience without declaring war. Sir Francis Drake became the living embodiment of this audacious new era. To the Spanish, he was El Drake, the dragon, a fearsome pirate who terrorized their settlements from the Caribbean to the Pacific. To the English, he was a national hero, a symbol of defiance and daring. His circumnavigation of the globe between 1577 and 1580 was a monumental feat, but its primary purpose was plunder. He returned to England with the Golden Hind laden with so much Spanish treasure that it paid off the entire national debt and provided a return of over 4,000% to his investors, which included the Queen herself. This single voyage demonstrated that vast fortunes could be made at Spain's expense. These piratical ventures served multiple purposes beyond simple enrichment. They were, in effect, a naval training program on a grand scale. English sailors learned to build, navigate, and fight in faster, more maneuverable ships designed for long-range raiding. They perfected hit-and-run tactics and became masters of seamanship in the unforgiving conditions of the open ocean. Each successful raid chipped away at the mystique of Spanish power, breeding new confidence and swagger within English maritime communities. The privateers were not just stealing gold, they were stealing the secrets of oceanic navigation and warfare, laying the groundwork for England's future naval supremacy. The line between piracy and patriotism was deliberately blurred. While Elizabeth publicly disavowed their actions, she privately knighted Drake upon his return, a clear signal of royal approval. This policy of calculated aggression fundamentally altered England's posture in the world. It was no longer a passive observer, but an active and disruptive challenger. The wealth brought back by the Sea Dogs fueled further investment in shipbuilding and exploration, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of maritime expansion. The apathetic envy of the early 16th century had transformed into an aggressive and profitable enterprise that set England on a direct collision course with the mightiest empire on earth. By the 1580s, the war at sea between England and Spain could no longer be contained. In 1588, King Philip assembled the Invincible Armada to end the English threat. It was the largest fleet Europe had ever seen, designed to crush the English navy. But the English fleet was composed of smaller, faster, more maneuverable ships. The confrontation took place in the English Channel. The English used fire ships, causing panic. Ferocious gales wrecked dozens of Spanish ships. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was a watershed moment and a pivotal event in the birth of the British Empire. It cleared the way for English ships to sail the world's oceans with newfound confidence. With the Spanish threat diminished, England focused on building its own empire in North America. The first attempts at colonization were fraught with peril and tragic failure, like the infamous Roanoke colony. These failures taught valuable lessons. Colonization required planning, investment, and understanding of the environment. The breakthrough came in 1607 with Jamestown, though it too teetered on collapse. Jamestown was saved by tobacco, pioneered by John Rolfe, which created a lucrative cash crop. This success established a template for future English colonization, built on agricultural exploitation, expansion, and labor. The early 17th century saw a shift in how England approached empire. State-sponsored ventures gave way to chartered companies like the East India Company. This outsourced costs to private investors, benefiting the crown through duties. Driven by commercial greed, this transformed English society, captivating a growing merchant class. Fortunes became linked to global trade. Mercantilism fueled this, viewing colonies as sources of raw materials. By the mid-17th century, the British Empire's components were in place: a powerful navy, colonies, and mercantilism. The seeds had taken firm root, ready to grow into a global empire. As the 17th century dawned, a new instrument of English ambition was born: the British East India Company. The charter granted it authority to acquire territory, mint currency, maintain an army, and wage war. Initially focused on the spice trade, the company's goals were purely commercial. As the Mughal Empire declined, the company realized its interests could only be protected through political and military intervention. Its private army expanded, recruiting European mercenaries and local sepoys. The pursuit of profit led it down a path of conquest. The East India Company's transformation from traders to rulers began with the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Robert Clive's victory, achieved through both force and betrayal, handed the company control of Bengal's immense wealth. With the right to collect taxes, the company became the de facto ruler, using Bengal's riches to fund further conquests across India. The company's rule was marked by ruthless economic exploitation. Indian industries were crushed, peasants overtaxed, and famines like the devastating Bengal famine of 1770 were worsened by company policies. The wealth extracted from India fueled Britain's industrial revolution, while India itself was impoverished and deindustrialized. By the mid-1800s, the company had built a private empire, ruling hundreds of millions through conquest, manipulation, and economic domination. While the company conquered India, Britain's Caribbean empire thrived on sugar and slavery. Sugar plantations demanded brutal labor, and British merchants turned to the transatlantic slave trade, becoming the world's leading slave traders. Millions of Africans were abducted, enduring the horrific Middle Passage to work in deadly conditions on Caribbean plantations. The profits from sugar and slavery enriched Britain, funding banks, industries, and grand estates, making the Caribbean colonies the empire's most valuable possessions. This wealth was built on unimaginable suffering, as enslaved people were stripped of their humanity for British profit. The sugar slave system became the engine of Britain's Atlantic economy, leaving a legacy of exploitation and pain. The triangular trade bound Britain, Africa, and the Americas in a cycle of exploitation. British goods bought enslaved Africans who were shipped to the Americas. Their forced labor produced sugar, cotton, and tobacco, which returned to Britain. Every stage generated profit, and the capital from slavery and plantations financed Britain's industrial revolution. Over 3 million Africans were transported by British ships, devastating families and entire regions. For Britain, profit always outweighed morality. The empire's prosperity was built on human misery. The motto was clear: profit over people. But by the late 1700s, the British Empire's wealth was measured in human suffering. India's peasants and enslaved Africans alike were reduced to cogs in a profit machine, their lives sacrificed for British gain. Nabobs from India and sugar barons from the Caribbean flaunted their fortunes, shaping British society and politics. A racist ideology justified this exploitation, casting colonized peoples as inferior and their subjugation as a civilizing mission. The empire's core principle was set. British interests always trumped the rights and welfare of the colonized. The transformation was complete. Britain was now an engine of global wealth extraction, regardless of the cost. Britain's rivalry with France exploded into the 7 Years' War, a global conflict fought across continents. Britain's victory redrew the world map, seizing Canada, Caribbean islands, and cementing dominance in India. The cost was immense, leading Britain to tax its American colonies, sparking the American Revolution and the loss of the 13 colonies. Losing America shifted Britain's focus eastward, reinforcing a model of direct exploitation over settler autonomy. The empire doubled down on control and profit, learning from its losses and expanding its reach in Asia and beyond. Britain emerged from these wars as the world's preeminent imperial power, with a hardened, more authoritarian vision for its empire. As the 19th century began, the Industrial Revolution gave Britain an unprecedented advantage. Abundant resources, innovation, and its colonial empire turned Britain into the first industrial nation. Its landscape was transformed, becoming the workshop of the world. Factories churned out goods that dominated global markets, using raw materials from colonies like India and Australia. Colonies became suppliers of raw goods and consumers of British products. Technological advancements like steamships and the telegraph aided imperial control. Weaponry, such as the Maxim gun, created military dominance. Railways facilitated resource extraction and troop deployment. The Industrial Revolution provided Britain the tools to build a global superpower. Following the East India Company's conquest, India became the most important territory, the jewel in the crown. A massive uprising in 1857 led to the end of company rule. In 1858, the British Crown took direct control, ushering in the British Raj. Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress and a new administration was put in place. Policies maximised India's economic benefit to Britain, ensuring political stability. India produced raw materials for export while its industries were suppressed. The British employed a strategy of divide and rule, categorising society and exploiting divisions. The Raj's core purpose was the subjugation of the Indian people for the glory of the British Empire. For centuries, European involvement in Africa was largely confined to coastal trading posts. However, in the last quarter of the 19th century, this changed dramatically. Driven by economic greed and nationalistic rivalry, the powers of Europe engaged in a frantic rush to colonize Africa. This period, known as the Scramble for Africa, saw Britain seize vast swathes of territory. The Industrial Revolution created a voracious appetite for new markets and raw materials. When diplomacy failed, brute military force was applied. By the early 20th century, Britain had carved out a colossal African empire, designed to facilitate the extraction of resources and to impose order. The Scramble for Africa represented the peak of Britain's imperial arrogance. In the late 19th century, the British Empire used the concept of a civilizing mission to justify its dominion. This ideology, famously articulated as the white man's burden, masked economic and political subjugation. Missionaries sought converts and established schools, often eradicating local customs. English education created a native elite to serve the colonial bureaucracy. British law, while promising justice, protected British interests and operated with racial bias. Order was maintained through force beneath a veneer of civilization. This superiority bred resentment, fueling resistance and the eventual dismantling of the empire. When war erupted in Europe in 1914, it engulfed the entire globe. The British Empire was automatically drawn into the conflict. Resources and manpower were mobilized from every corner of the earth. Over 1.5 million Indian soldiers and laborers served overseas. The war ended in victory for Britain and its allies in 1918. However, this victory was achieved at a catastrophic cost. The victory was hollow, leaving Britain profoundly weakened. The Great War bled the empire dry. During the Great War, Britain made promises to its colonies in exchange for their loyalty and sacrifice. Colonial soldiers returned home with a new perspective. These hopes were brutally dashed as Britain sought to restore imperial control. Repressive measures led to outrage, culminating in the Amritsar massacre. This event fueled Indian nationalism and the rise of Gandhi. Anti-colonial resistance surged across the empire. Loyalty transformed into a demand for freedom. The stage was set for a global conflict that would deliver the final blow. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Britain once again found itself embroiled in a global conflict for its very existence. As in the First War, the empire was immediately mobilized. Millions of soldiers from India, Africa, and the Dominions were called upon to fight against the Axis powers in Europe, North Africa, and Asia. The British Indian Army became the largest volunteer army in history, with over 2.5 million men serving. The resources of the empire were once again Britain's lifeline, providing the strategic depth and manpower that allowed it to stand alone against Hitler for a crucial period of the war. The fight against fascism was a noble cause, but for Britain it would be a Pyrrhic victory. The war in Asia had a particularly devastating impact on the prestige of the British Empire. The rapid fall of Singapore in 1942 was a moment of profound humiliation. Considered an impregnable fortress, the Gibraltar of the East, Its swift capture by Japanese forces shattered the myth of European military superiority. Tens of thousands of British and Imperial troops were taken prisoner. For the people of Asia, seeing an Asian power so decisively defeat a European one was a revelation. It proved that the British were not invincible. The aura of power and permanence that had surrounded the empire for generations was irrevocably broken. The spell had been lifted. Meanwhile, the economic cost of the Second World War was even more crippling than the First. To fund the war, Britain was forced to sell off its overseas assets and accumulate massive debts, once again primarily to the United States. By 1945, the country was effectively bankrupt. Its cities had been bombed, its industries were worn out, and its people were exhausted. Britain emerged from the war on the winning side, but it was a shadow of its former self. It simply no longer possessed the financial resources or the political will to maintain a vast global empire against a rising tide of opposition. The economic foundations of the imperial structure had crumbled to dust. The war also fundamentally changed the global political landscape. The ideals championed by the Allies, especially in the Atlantic Charter signed by Churchill and Roosevelt, once again spoke of the right of all peoples to choose their own form of government. While Churchill may have intended this to apply only to nations under Nazi rule, independence leaders across the empire seized upon this promise. How could Britain claim to be fighting for freedom in Europe while denying it to hundreds of millions in its own colonies? The hypocrisy was too glaring to ignore. The war fought to save freedom had made the continuation of empire morally and practically untenable. The world that emerged from the rubble of the Second World War in 1945 was a fundamentally different place. The old European powers, including a victorious but bankrupt Britain, were exhausted and diminished. In their place stood two new global superpowers with immense military and economic might: the United States and the Soviet Union. Both of these new titans were, for their own reasons, ideologically opposed to the old European model of colonialism. They saw the empires of Britain and France as relics of a bygone era, obstacles to their own visions for the post-war world order. The age of European imperial dominance was over. The United States, now the world's leading economic power and Britain's main creditor, had a long history of anti-colonial sentiment. American leaders viewed the British Empire's system of preferential trade as a barrier to free markets and their own economic expansion. They put immense pressure on Britain to decolonize, seeing independent nations as potential new allies and trading partners in the emerging Cold War. While Britain was a crucial ally against communism, the Americans made it clear that their support did not extend to preserving the British Empire. The financial leverage held by Washington was a powerful tool to push London towards granting independence to its colonies. On the other side of the new global divide, the Soviet Union championed itself as the leader of the anti-imperialist struggle. It offered ideological, financial, and sometimes military support to nationalist movements and liberation struggles across the developing world. Communism's promise of social equality and its fierce condemnation of colonial exploitation held a powerful appeal for many independence leaders fighting against British rule. For Britain, this meant that any attempt to suppress a nationalist movement risked pushing that movement into the arms of the Soviets, a prospect that was deeply alarming to both London and Washington during the tense standoff of the Cold War. Caught between these two powerful forces, Britain found its room for manoeuvre severely limited. The winds of change, as British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan would later call them, were blowing fiercely. The international climate was now hostile to empire. The United Nations provided a global platform for colonized peoples to voice their demands for freedom. The rise of the superpowers had created a new geopolitical reality in which maintaining a sprawling, expensive, and rebellious empire was no longer a viable option. The wars had broken Britain's bank and its will to rule. The New World Order ensured there was no going back. The fate of the entire British Empire hinged on the fate of its most important possession, India. By the end of the Second World War, Indian independence was no longer a question of if, but when and how. The Indian National Congress, led by Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, had mobilized the masses through decades of non-violent resistance, making the country ungovernable. The British Labour government, elected in 1945, recognized the inevitable. Exhausted by war and facing immense pressure from the United States, they were committed to leaving India. The jewel in the crown was simply too costly and too difficult to hold on to any longer. The process of withdrawal, however, was a catastrophic failure. The British, in their haste to depart, agreed to a plan to partition the subcontinent along religious lines, creating a Hindu-majority India and a Muslim-majority Pakistan. The decision was made with insufficient planning and a shocking disregard for the complex, interwoven reality of Indian society, where communities had lived side by side for centuries. The drawing of the new borders by a British lawyer who had never been to India before ignited a firestorm of communal violence. It was a frantic and desperate attempt to manage an exit, but it led to one of the most horrific tragedies of the 20th century. As the British pulled out in August 1947, chaos erupted. Up to 15 million people were uprooted in the largest mass migration in human history, as Hindus and Sikhs fled Pakistan and Muslims fled India. Unspeakable violence broke out along the new borders. Mobs, incited by religious hatred, massacred men, women and children. It is estimated that up to 2 million people were killed in the bloodshed of the partition. This was the bloody, tragic price of Britain's imperial exit. The empire that had prided itself on bringing order to India left the subcontinent in a state of horrific sectarian violence, leaving a legacy of bitterness and conflict that endures to this day. The independence of India and Pakistan in 1947 marked the beginning of the end for the British Empire. It was a clear signal to other colonies that the imperial power was in terminal decline. If Britain could not hold on to its most prized possession, it could not hope to hold on to smaller territories in Africa or the Caribbean. The loss of India removed the primary economic and strategic justification for much of the rest of the empire, such as the control of the Suez Canal. The wars had broken Britain's power, and the bloody, chaotic end of the Raj had shattered any remaining moral claim to imperial rule. The dominoes were now set to fall. In 1947, the departure from India removed the keystone from the imperial arch. With the jewel in the crown gone, the logic that held the empire together began to unravel. India's independence inspired nationalist movements, demonstrating that the British Empire could be forced to retreat. The empire was visibly shrinking, retreating from territories it could no longer afford. The British government shifted to manage decline, aiming to preserve economic interests and foster friendly relations. However, this planned retreat would soon be shattered. The Suez Crisis in 1956 signaled the end of Britain's superpower status. The Suez Canal, vital for Middle East oil, was nationalized by Egypt's Nasser. Prime Minister Eden, seeing Nasser as a threat, conspired with France and Israel to retake it. Military intervention was initially successful, but the US, under President Eisenhower, demanded Britain withdraw. Britain capitulated, ending Eden's career and demonstrating its dependence on the US. The Suez Crisis marked the definitive end of British imperial power. The Suez Crisis exposed Britain's vulnerability. Emboldening African nationalist leaders, Prime Minister Harold Macmillan acknowledged the wind of change blowing through Africa. Ghana's independence in 1957 under Kwame Nkrumah sparked a chain reaction. While Britain pursued peaceful transfers of power like in Nigeria, violence erupted where white settlers resisted. The Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya and the Rhodesian Bush War revealed the brutal realities of decolonization. By the mid-1960s, most of Britain's African empire was dismantled, leaving new nations to forge their own paths. While Africa and Asia dominated headlines, the final chapters of the British Empire were being written in its smaller territories. In the Caribbean, sugar colonies moved towards independence, though the process was complex. Many islands were small and vulnerable, experimenting with a political federation that ultimately collapsed. Islands sought independence individually, leaving behind a legacy of economic dependency. Decolonization continued globally as Britain relinquished control over protectorates and islands. Places like Fiji, Malta and Cyprus became sovereign states. By the 1980s, only a handful of overseas territories remained, the most significant being Hong Kong. The handover of Hong Kong to China in 1997 marked the definitive end of the British Empire. As the British flag was lowered and the Chinese flag raised, more than 3 centuries of British imperial history closed. As the formal structure of the empire dissolved, a new voluntary organization rose to take its place. This was the Commonwealth of Nations, an association composed primarily of Great Britain and its former colonies. Its origins lay in the early 20th century with the self-governing dominions like Canada and Australia, but it was transformed by the entry of newly independent republics like India. It was reimagined as a free and equal partnership of sovereign states, united by a shared history, common values, and the English language. The British monarch remained as the symbolic head of the Commonwealth, a link to the shared imperial past. For Britain, the Commonwealth provided a way to manage the decline of its power gracefully. It was an attempt to salvage influence from the ashes of empire, to maintain a global role when its military and economic might had faded. The Commonwealth offered a platform for cooperation, allowing Britain to maintain close ties with the nations it once ruled. The biennial meetings of Commonwealth heads of government and the popular Commonwealth Games were visible symbols of this new post-imperial relationship. It was a ghost of the old empire, stripped of its coercive power, but preserving historical connections. For the newly independent member states, joining the Commonwealth offered several advantages. It provided a ready-made international forum where small nations could have their voices heard. It facilitated educational exchanges and trade links. Crucially, membership was entirely voluntary and did not compromise their sovereignty. It was a way to acknowledge historical ties to Britain without being subordinate to it. The Commonwealth became a diverse and evolving organization, championing causes like the opposition to apartheid in South Africa, often putting it in direct conflict with the British government itself. Today, the Commonwealth continues to exist, a sprawling organization of over 50 countries representing more than 2 billion people. However, its relevance in the 21st century is subject to ongoing debate. To some, it is a unique network for global cooperation, a positive legacy of a difficult history. To others, it is an anachronistic relic, a neo-colonial institution that papers over brutal imperial realities. Ultimately, the Commonwealth stands as the final echo of the British Empire, a testament to its immense historical reach, but also a reminder of a world-spanning structure of power that has irrevocably fallen. The story of the British Empire's fall was not a clean break. Its ghost lingers still, casting a long shadow over the 21st century world. To understand the modern world, we must first understand the world the empire made. We live today among its ruins and its relics, its triumphs and its traumas. On one side, the empire left behind institutions that define many modern nations. The English language became a global tool, but also supplanted indigenous tongues. Yet, for every mile of railway, there is a corresponding story of pain. The empire's legacy is also one of deep, unhealed wounds. The arbitrary borders drawn by British cartographers have become the fault lines for civil wars. The transatlantic slave trade left a legacy of profound racial injustice. It was simultaneously a force of connection and division, of creation and destruction. It built institutions and shattered societies. The shadow of the empire is a complex pattern of light and shade that we are still learning to navigate. In the decades since the empire's fall, a great reckoning has begun. Former colonies are reclaiming their own histories, challenging the romanticized narratives that once dominated. It is about adding the voices of the colonized to the chorus. Statues of imperial figures have become flashpoints, sparking debates about who we memorialize. Museums face pressure to repatriate looted artifacts. They are profound conversations about ownership and justice. The empire's legacy continues to shape our present. We must have an honest understanding of historical origins. It is a mirror, held up to the complexities of power. Remembering this history is an act of maturity. It is the only way to build a more just future.